Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of Tell It Like It Is, the show where my guests get to share their lives and opinions however they see fit. Today's guest is Arizona State Barrett Honors Professor Gregg Pascal Zachary. He spent 13 years as a senior writer for the Wall Street Journal and was named the journal's most interesting journalist in the year 2000 by the Boston Globe. He has authored 4 books and has covered a wide range of topics from African affairs to the future of technology. Professor Zachary, it is a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dowd.
So let's start with talking about your books. Which one did you enjoy writing the most and why?
Well, the book that has made me proudest is a biography of the man who organized the Manhattan Project and named Vannevar Bush, and that book was published in 1997, and that was a kind of bridge to the world of scholarship because I did primary historical research. He was one of the most important early designers of computers. He was the political mobilizer of science and engineering during World War II and an advisor to President Roosevelt. So he was a significant person that had both technological, engineering, political aspects to him, and that spoke to my interests. And the experience gave me confidence I could participate in an academic scholarly community. That book's called Endless Frontier, Vannevar Bush, Engineer of the American Century. And another book I wrote is called Diversity Advantage, which is about ethnicity, race, nationality, and innovation.
So you actually enjoyed quite a considerable amount of fame in the 90s.
I was big in the 90s.
You referenced it a lot.
I was big in the 90s. I went to Davos. I knew world leaders, and I was frequently on page 1 of the Wall Street Journal, and I practiced what I thought of was a higher order form of journalism where we tried to blend scholarship and deeper research as well as reporting on the real world. We did a form of reporting some people call immersive reporting, where we would spend a lot of time in a particular place and very close to people. I would sleep over people's houses. I would see them multiple times. That wasn't the only kind of stories I did, but those were the kinds of stories that people would remember.
So kind of before that, and I don't know exactly if this kind of jump-started your journalistic career, but you were one of the last staff members for the Berkeley Barb, which I found fascinating. Could you kind of...
You knew about the Berkeley Barb, huh?
Yeah, I did some deep dive, and I was hoping you could kind of explain what that was and how you came to be involved with it, and then kind of the impact it had both locally in Berkeley and nationally.
Well, I mean, in my youth, I was a troublemaker. I was trying to fail. I was very intent on failing. I thought there would be something highly educational about failure, and indeed there was. I practice an approach to achievement that might be called indirection. I don't think you should just pursue a straight line to what you want to do. In the case of the Berkeley Barb, I was actually very interested in literary writing when I graduated from college. I went to a university in New York. I was a philosophy student. And when I went to California, at the age of 23, I took a bus out to California, and I'll never forget, I arrived the day of a gay parade on Castro Street. The bus took us straight to Castro Street and dropped us off at the gay parade. It was very funny. I wasn't gay at the time, and I'm still not gay, but I did find it interesting to see throngs of men. I must say I was good looking then, and I was very thin, and I was young. I was only 23. A lot of men were interested in me. I tried my best to defend myself, but I then moved to Berkeley across the bay and tried to develop both as a political journalist and as a fiction writer and essayist. And within a couple of years, I joined the staff of the Berkeley Barb, which was not in its heyday. Its heyday was really about sex, drugs, rock and roll. It's hard to believe how puritanical and straight-laced newspapers and the media were in the 1970s. So this was already 1978, but the Barb started in the mid-60s, and a lot of the writers and photographers were not trained. They were inspired amateurs. There was a legion of papers around the country that grew up as weeklies in opposition to the daily newspaper and to television journalism, which seemed very sanitized. Sex and music, there were new forms of sexual expression. The Barb had sex ads from women and men basically saying, if you would like to have sex with me, call this phone number. That was kind of so music, sexuality, and then radical politics, which meant at the time opposition to the Vietnam War, and then some kind of promotion of civil rights and racial integration. By the time of the late 70s, the environmental movement had become very important, so there was a sort of environmental aspect to it, and the Vietnam War had ended in the mid-70s, so the war no longer was an organizing principle, opposition to the war. A curious thing happened. Feminism. The Barb came under the influence of women activists in Berkeley who said the sex ads were demeaning to women. And the owner was an old Jewish guy who, he was like in his 40s, and he seemed old. He was from the Beat generation. He was like a beatnik. He would be like a contemporary of Norman Mailer. And he was very interested in sex, and he had divorced his wife, who was a photographer, Jane Scher, and he had created a Bahamian corporation, meaning a corporation in the Bahamas that owned the Barb, and he didn't want to give up the sex ads, but he knew he had to take them out of the Barb. So without asking anybody, he created a sex publication called The Spectator, and that sex publication was run out of the same office as the Barb. So one day I'm sitting around reading probably State and Revolution by Lenin, all kinds of radical newspapers around the country, because there was no internet. If you wanted to read other newspapers in the 70s, you needed a physical copy, if not microfilm. It was very cumbersome. So the Barb would get all these papers, and in ducks the head into the office I'm sitting in, a man named Spencer Rumsey, who later became a significant editor at Newsday, very important newspaper in the 80s and 90s. And he said to me, "Zach, are you doing anything?" And I said, "Well, I'm just reading all these papers and I'm enriching myself." He said, "Okay, so you're free. Listen, I've got Mistress Cat coming in." And the person doing the interview scratched. "Do you mind just interviewing her? She's the leading bondage person in San Francisco." That's bondage, meaning handcuffing and whipping men.
Not bonds and stocks.
That's right.
I want to clarify.
Yeah, and so I did that interview and I wrote it up kind of as a straight story. I asked tough questions like, how does it feel when you're forcing a man who's handcuffed to clean your bathroom, things like that. Basics, and I had a flair for it. But this problem of funding journalism that we see today, I was well aware of from my youth. So when I did move into mainstream journalism, I was very glad that the Wall Street Journal was charging $100,000 for a full-page ad, because I was an expense. My whole career I've been an expense, and so I've lived a charmed life. But I used that alternative weekly experience to become better at interpretive writing and interpretive reporting. I can do daily newspaper reporting, but there's very little value now in quick transaction journalism. And so in the 80s and 90s, a lot of newspapers and magazines began hiring people from the alternative press because they had both a point of view and they weren't time-bound. They could work multiple weeks on articles and bring something together. And two of the books that I've written initially came out of doing feature articles. So, we saw a sense of scaling, and that's what a lot of journalists would like to achieve, is a gateway into writing books or magazine articles or doing television documentaries. More of that's happened, or film documentaries. So, I began at the bottom, you might say. But it had a formative effect on me.
So the Barb was also involved with some satirical pieces. And one that I found very interesting was the Bananadyne story. Are you familiar with the story?
No, I'm not. But one of the things the Barb prided itself on was graphics, caricatures, drawings, a lot of popular art. There was a particular guy, R. Crumb. There were others that became well known. They had alternative comics, which you might think of as graphic novels, and they were racy and somewhat more in your face than what newspapers were used to.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you're right. Taking the journalists didn't take themselves that seriously, and there was more of a spirit of fun and irreverence.
Well, I'm not sure how much other publications had that sense of kind of lightheartedness, because in reference to the Bananadyne story, so the owner of the Berkeley Barb wanted basically to get the government to ban bananas as a satire. So he wrote a piece that banana shavings had psychedelic effects, and smoking the shavings of a banana peel would.
How did you find that? Where were the sources on that?
I was just doing a Google search about the Berkeley Barb. Basically just hyperlinked, and I found this. And so basically the New York Times picked it up, and they said that if anything, smoking the banana or the peels of a banana would only produce mild psychoactive effects.
Yeah, well, that kind of spoof and parody, you're right. We would tweak the mainstream people who we thought of as stiffs, unimaginative. And what did happen was mainstream journalism took on many of these characteristics. And if you look at something like The Daily Show under Jon Stewart, or Colbert, or currently John Oliver, they are taking techniques of journalism analysis that come out of the alternative press and also come out of some of the mainstream journalists themselves today. Maureen Dowd has used satire at the New York Times. I mean, there's just a range of people who are trying different approaches. And the boom in documentaries, which is, because the web doesn't have the constraints of over-the-air television in terms of time, we see this golden age of documentaries occurring, and they're using cinematic and novelistic techniques to follow people over time. I did do something I'm proud of. I did do a documentary called Code Rush about the lives of some programmers at Netscape and what happened to them and their product, and that aired on PBS. I did it with somebody named Dave Winton, who was the director, and I was the writer. But these techniques of working on that you learn from working on the outside can be very helpful. I also was a big believer that journalists should have dramatic training. I myself tried to become a stand-up comedian and failed. I went to the Holy City Zoo where Robin Williams would perform, and I went to these comedy clubs, and frankly I was terrible. But I did have the knowledge that I went to high school with Jerry Seinfeld of Seinfeld fame, and I knew for sure because I was funnier than him, and that's not easy. I mean, it's Jerry Seinfeld. Even in high school he was funny, but I was funnier. And, it was a missed opportunity maybe that I didn't stick with it. But I was more cerebral than Jerry Seinfeld. I think that's fair to say. And I was drawn to writing and drawn to serious subjects. And Jerry wasn't. Maybe I was just too serious to succeed in comedy. But there were a lot of acting qualities. And I think that when you're building source networks and interviewing and managing sources, a lot of times theatrical methods could help. How do you command sources? How do you intimidate or frighten them when necessary? How do you woo and cajole them? I mean, there's a lot to building and maintaining sources that you could, where acting training would help you. So I think that's one big, I think that we should be more honest about what a lot of journalists are doing. It's more theatrical than it is content, and they should be trained more in theatrical work. And one of the reasons why Jon Stewart and John Oliver and these comedians are so successful with news mockery that has real content is they're just simply more interesting and see more interesting ways of putting stories together. This whole notion that the journalist is outside of the story, it's often a deceit, not a conceit. It's that too. It's a kind of vanity. Journalists think they're above everything. But also it's lying. And journalists who lie, which is most of them now, pretending they're not part of the story, they're not making value judgments, they're not a partisan, this is undermining the audience. The audience is going to people who are clearly partisan because they believe that the people who say they're not partisan actually are anyway. And so it's this theatrical element is very important now to successful journalists on the air especially.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a lot of people's biggest complaint with mainstream media is that they aren't genuine and they don't.
Right.
They just feel like they're pretending there's something they're not, which is what you spoke to.
Yeah, they're scripted. Yeah. And they're afraid to reveal their actual feelings and thoughts. Yeah, no, it's a good point.
I want to transition because I would really want to cover all aspects of your life. Your website says that you...
That sounds cruel.
So I don't want to make you relive anything that you don't want to.
You've looked at my website. Good.
I have.
That's I'm impressed.
And it mentions that you've been to Africa 40 times. What initially sparked your interest in the continent, and what kept you coming back?
Yeah, and at this point it's 55 times. I've made 55 trips since 2000. One is that a lot of researchers on Africa are no longer based there. So it's a hardship post for a lot of people, and there isn't enough maybe business to support year-round, say living in Uganda or Ghana. And so you can parachute in. It's a bit of a paradise for parachutists. You can go for 2-3 weeks. Usually you hop through Europe. Obviously people living in London, very close to West Africa. East Africa is a bit further, but you're much closer from Europe. And mostly I did reporting on these visits to Africa, but as the years went on, from 2000 when I started it for the Wall Street Journal visiting Sub-Saharan Africa, by the end of it I was working for the Gates Foundation. Visiting Africa also coincided with 9/11, where journalism, especially in the early 2000s, became really a captive of the state. The New York Times, the Post, they had very well documented cases of capitulating to the government. I myself, sadly, had known Danny Pearl, who was abducted and killed by people in Pakistan, and the combination of the difficulty of being a foreign correspondent, which I was at the time of Danny's death, and my interest in Africa changed my perspective. I felt the response to what I was seeing in Sub-Saharan Africa, that journalism wasn't an appropriate response, that I wanted to do something that involved more engagement, more direct involvement. And so I maintained writing and research, but my journalism was episodic. And I worked on some different aid projects. I started a training program in Ghana. I've had a project in East Africa about science and an East African university. So, but mostly it also taught me about aspects of life that I'd neglected, I think. Many Africans are forced to live in the present. It's hard to plan because they don't have resources maybe to plan, or there's uncertainty. And I find that most Americans live in the past or the future. They don't engage the present very well. So I felt I got a big gift from visiting Africa so many times. I got the gift of the present. I got to hold tents. That's a lot. There's only 3 of them.
This is true. Well, actually, regrettably, I'm going to have to make you look towards the future now. Because my next question is, what worries you most about the future? But also, what are you most excited for?
Those are big questions. I mean, the challenges of the environment, the challenges of health, the sense that the internet has let people down, so that while computing is one of the great human achievements and computer networks of the late 20th century and into the 21st century, we now are facing more squarely the shortcomings of computer networks and the difficulties of distinguishing between the artificial and the real, amplifying lies on the internet and animus, bad feelings, is easier and cheaper than ever before, and this has caused instability, and we just don't know how to manage it. Some of the truisms about free speech, that speech is always good, we may have to rethink now. Europe seems more willing to make accommodations between control and harmful speech than the U.S. is. And the U.S. is dealing with a lot of difficult problems as a result. The technologies that have brought us to a uncertain relationship with the environment are also the technologies that may have to save us. So there's this paradox that the technological interventions that have made climate change a reality, and all the unpredictability of climate change, that we may have to draw on some of these same technologies to fix it. And that's worrisome in principle because of unintended consequences and what might go wrong. When we started driving cars 120 years ago using gasoline, we never thought, A, we'd run out of oil, and B, we never thought that it would have such harsh external effects, both immediate in the form of air pollution and then longer term climate change. And so, coupled with the vast growth of people on the planet, there's very, very high challenges that we face, and how we meet them is a task for the next generation. But I think I was born in 1955, so I'm sort of midpoint baby boomer. I'm younger than President Clinton, but I'm older than President Obama. And my age group is still young enough to have an effect on national and world affairs, but the problems are mounting more quickly than we realized or expected, and then the political climate is confusing to us. So there's a sense that we shouldn't be overly optimistic.
Is there something that you're excited about in the future?
Well, I mean, personally, look, I think the ability for young people to express themselves and to learn comprehensively and quickly is unmatched in human history. I think the freedom for women, half the population, is greater than ever, and that's a big achievement. I also think that the mixing of people of different races and different nationalities and different religions is occurring on an enormous scale, It's generated a backlash, this kind of mixing, that we're trying to understand what are the limits to the backlash and how to manage the frustrations people have. But if you compare the state of acceptance, of difference, it's vastly higher today than 50 years ago in the United States. In 1967, there were 12 states that said it was against the law for black and white people to marry. The state of Oregon, until the 1950s, didn't allow black people to live there. We've seen an enormous rise in the possibilities for black Americans and for their actualities, for their achievements, with the large immigration of the past 40 years, really starting in 1980. The composition of the United States is vastly different than the world that I was born into. On the coasts of the U.S., people seem to find this a source of strength, as I argued in my book. It's an advantage, this level of diversity, in states like California and New York. But there's other parts of the country that seem deeply offended and anxious around this diversity, even as they tolerate it. So I think that my sense of optimism is limited. Even in the area of expression, the technologies of today, while they are allowing a lot of diverse voices, there's still a concentration of winners. And there's a fragmentation of voices too, so that it's not easy to know. If we think of, the way Walter Cronkite commanded the attention of the nation with a literate, if limited, view of the world, there were benefits to that. People had a shared experience of the country they lived in, of the state they lived in, the city they lived in. Now this is less likely to come about, and people are seemingly more connected and yet more isolated. So my favorite saying is, things will get worse before they get better. So to the extent that you have longevity on your side and are young, there could well be better days ahead. But these seem like dark days in the United States. Around the world, the war on terror and the way the tensions between countries seem much greater than they were in the 90s, when South Africa abandoned segregation without a bullet being fired. The Soviet Union broke up voluntarily, exposing hundreds of millions of people to to experience a freedom they thought they could never achieve, ever. Many parts of the world in the 90s vastly changed for the better, and there was a period of optimism about where the entire planet was going that's absent today. And so I think sources of optimism are going to be much more personal today than they were in the 90s or, say, in the 60s, when there was a more widespread sense of optimism. And so I also think that the pressure to be positive and hopeful, while understandable, is imposing blinders on people. So the litmus test for Americans often is, we're the can-do people, things will get better on our watch. It's a canard. It's artificial. And we have to squarely face the problems we've got. And I think that there's a sense of escapism today that could have dangerous effects down the line.
If you could relive any decade, which decade would you pick?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I mean, That's an interesting one. Probably the 70s. I was unhappy as a youth. And also in the 70s, the Vietnam War ended in defeat. Richard Nixon was forced to resign. National politics seemed bereft of leaders, in part because leaders had been assassinated. I was 13 years old when Martin Luther King was killed. I was well aware of what was going on around me. Robert Kennedy's death was very saddening. That occurred around the same time. So we entered the 70s with this sense that we were handicapped by political violence and by defeat. Jimmy Carter was not particularly inspiring. He's been a great post-president, but the 70s were a time of confusion and disillusion, and in my own life, I was mired in failure. And I had studied philosophy, classical philosophy, ancient philosophy, in part because the present seemed awful and dispiriting, and I retreated into older forms of wisdom. I didn't read a newspaper or magazine or barely watch television for a few years in the mid-70s because my own sense of disenchantment was great. And if you looked at what was happening, there seemed to be a lot of cynicism in the society. But interestingly, the 80s proved to be, and the 90s, proved to be decades of renewal and redemption for Americans of different sources. Ronald Reagan, for all his cinematic bluster and for renewing Republicans after the crack-up of Richard Nixon, was a genuinely free-spirited and open-hearted guy. And if you look at the people he put on the Supreme Court and his social policies, they were very moderate and inclusive. And the breakup of the Soviet Union, which was one result of his bluster and his escalating nuclear weapons policies, had enormous achievements. I met Gorbachev, actually, in San Francisco in the 90s. And Gorbachev's a personal hero of mine because without Gorbachev, Reagan's achievement wasn't possible. Gorbachev had to relinquish power. He could have held on. I spoke with him through a translator, of course, so it didn't have the same effect as if I talked to him myself. I complimented him. I asked him why he did what he did. And there was a sense in which the Soviet Union, the dictatorship of the Communist Party, was exhausted. And one can only hope that the autocrats and dictators of America will come to the same sense of exhaustion that imperiled the commissars of the Soviet Union and just quit. They'll just give up to stop what they're doing. So, to the extent that the 90s was this period of peace dividend and relative prosperity as well as peace and stronger government, better funded government, we could get there again.
So from this point, the questions are going to get kind of more fun, more lighthearted, and have less continuity to them.
That's okay.
So on that note...
Now, I know you, Mr. Dowd, from our class. We have a class together, and you should disclose that to the audience, which is why you're so comfortable with me.
This is true.
You're used to some of the outlandish statements that I make.
Yeah. And
you would be recoiling in horror.
Yeah, and I have a good background of what to ask. So.
calling one of the Cronkite faculty, so I think it's good that you've been prepared. You're well prepared.
Yeah, and so since I do know you, I know that you have a very unique style choice. Stylistically, you come with a very different outfit every day. Where do you draw your fashion sense from?
That's very funny that you notice, and I'm flattered that you do, because I'm really trying to be more than an intellectual model. I'm really trying to be a fashion model. It's really true, toward the students. And perhaps the African clothes come from a lot of visits to Africa, and I had my own tailors in a few different African cities, so having clothes tailored to you is always exciting. And then my wife, who's from West Africa, worked at Macy's when she first came to the United States, and I began shopping at Macy's and upgrading my American wardrobe. Currently, I've got a major shoe fetish to the point that I'm banned from buying any more shoes.
By your wife? Or?
By my wife, yes, that's right. Yeah. I have to sneak shoes into the house. If it wasn't that I'm already under other bans from my wife, the shoe ban might be more objectionable, but there's just a sort of checkerboard of bans I'm under, and so, but the shoes, and then I also believe in the dignity of teaching. To say that I'm old school in teaching, I'm a bit of a Germanic style teacher. I'm bossy. I'm not that tolerant of student opinions if the opinions are bad or wrong. I've never been one to sacrifice veracity for discussion, okay? When students are saying things that are dumb, I intervene. So I like to have a wardrobe on that shows respect for the office of professordom. I'm in a school, and we won't name the school, but my director will often wear a t-shirt that shows his unadorned belly. You know, he's a schlubby guy, and for this guy to comb his hair is like an inspired fashion move, okay? But I don't want to have a t-shirt that shows too much skin. So I will wear often long sleeve t-shirts. Those are one of my specialties. I like long sleeve t-shirts if I need to wear a t-shirt. When I wear a short sleeve shirt, I will wear an undershirt for two reasons. The air conditioning, you can get sick. I mean, it's like you really need multiple wardrobes in Arizona. I find wardrobe changes are key to survive in this place. So I'll sometimes wear underclothing that could serve as outer clothing if necessary. And then the air conditioning, I think sometimes requires you to have additional clothing. Also, now, this looks great on me. I have a beautifully shaped head. I've been told that by at least a few people. And then shaving my head was a big step. My wife, again, she's from West Africa, and she declared war on my body hair. Say about 2004 or 5. It's been at least a decade, maybe 12 years. So initially that meant trying to get unruly hair under control. At first she thought some hair could remain. But within a couple of years she realized, you know what? Get rid of it all. So when you have this kind of hairstyle and you're like under an air conditioning duct, you really want to have hats nearby. So I tend to wear head coverings. And a lot of men in your generation don't wear hats anymore. I have a lot of hats, a variety of them.
Man of many hats, you could say.
Fedoras and Irish caps, and so I'm a big hat person. And lately, I wear, although not today, I do wear different necklaces and African jewelry, shrunken heads. That's one of my favorites because I do want to convey to people who are opposed to me that if I vanquish them, they could have a place in my shrunken head gallery.
Are there a lot of those people who are opposed to you?
Yes, but people oppose me at their peril is what I like to think. So it's funny you say the fashion, but I do think there is a certain dignity. And I'm a bit put off by how casual the dressing among students is. For many years when I first got here, I described the style of dressing as nearly naked.
Wow.
Yeah, I thought, you know what? There should be some basic idea that clothes are meant to cover your body. I'm old-fashioned.
All right. If there was a pill to make you immortal, would you take it?
Well, if it would make you immortal at the prime of your life and maintain that prime, perhaps that would be interesting. But I do think what many of us fear once we passed our prime, which I definitely have passed, is that we will perhaps be incapacitated or lose something that made us feel fully alive. And I think more and more people are thinking deeply about at what price do they extend their lives. Is there a balance you can strike, and then if you get on the other side of that balance, is it time to say goodbye? And nevertheless, I don't handle thoughts of my own demise well. So I would say, but immortality seems like a dramatic remedy for the problem of death. Maybe there's something like another 20 years. How about that? As opposed to immortality.
What year would you consider the prime that you would want to live at forever?
Well, I mean, I think that many people by their 40s have achieved a psychological strength and sometimes a professional strength, that they might want to perpetuate. There are other people who feel that their golden years, whenever they may start, 50s or 60s or 70s, is when they have the most wisdom. They're no longer ensnared in the need to earn money. Maybe that's the best time of life for them. Honestly, few people say they wish they were 23 forever. No offense to the young people. And I do often say to students that being young is overrated. And then in my own life, I feel very much that I've done things backwards. So things that I might have done in my youth, I did in my 40s and 50s. Because I had more resources, I had more clarity of purpose. But I didn't act my age as a result.
So I saw an article today. It's called the Hello Sig Electronic Technology Company. And they came out with a new vape juice where you can vape erectile dysfunction drugs. Bad timing with the question. I apologize.
That's very funny.
What's your reaction to that?
So in other words, so they're turning like Viagra into a gas or a...
Essentially, yeah. It was Cialis flavored, I believe.
Oh, wow. Well, I can tell you that shows you the extent to which vaping as a delivery system is getting popular. I myself have never smoked cigarettes. So, and the era in which I first smoked marijuana, it was a social activity. People were sitting around smoking. And then for many years, I didn't smoke marijuana. Actually, arriving in Arizona, perhaps because of the environmental challenges of being surrounded by what I euphemistically call the worst bunch of white people west of the Mississippi, but objectively, of course, that can't be the case. They're all wonderful people. I've had to smoke marijuana more. Part of it is just coping with the stress. The other part is that I found that older people often are taking sleeping pills or taking some kind of sedatives. I have quite a few friends, I don't want to name names, that are on mood-altering drugs. Zoloft, say. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not on any of those things. I'm what I call naked. I don't resort to crutches like Zoloft or sedatives. So for me, the pot strain of sativa helps me sleep. And I think that the trade-offs around a good night's sleep are a challenge for older people because young people sleep less, old people sleep less. There's some variety of reasons for this. But young people may have the energy to power through some of that. Old people often don't. The other thing is, you might say, well, why would I want to spend an evening in a marijuana-induced haze that's, say, been supplemented by a glass of wine? Well, I'm 63 years old. I'm not going to be creating a path-breaking essay on epistemology after 6 p.m. I just want to have 5 or 6 hours of high creativity, high functioning during the daytime. This is, and so paradoxically, it turns out that marijuana is more effective and appealing to older people than younger people. Because I actually think that younger people take a lot of risks smoking marijuana. Because, like, I've got a son who's 28, and he's a young aspiring scientist. He really doesn't smoke at all. He went to Santa Cruz. He knows what marijuana is, UC Santa Cruz, but he's got a lot of cognitive power. He's got an active mind. I don't. I mean, I'm not kidding. I mean, I get tired. I don't have the periods of sustained creativity for 12, 14, 16 hours that I actually used to have as a younger person. So I think the vaping part is there's a set of young people that, for whatever reason, are in smoke-free environments. And then there's a set of old people who don't want to inhale smoke because they think it affects their lungs. I've just decided that I'm close enough to death that I'm not going to worry about the effect on my lungs because it's not at all like smoking cigarettes. But this vaping thing to me is off-putting. I was walking into Armstrong Hall yesterday, and a guy who was not in my class, I have a 60-person class, but was vaping as he walks in, and I'm, it's the kinder, gentler Gregg Zachary right now, but in my old days, I would have slapped that kid silly. I mean, I would have been like, hey, buddy, whoa! I would have used my military bearing on him and got him to stop, because I just don't think this is appropriate that you should be vaping around. And then there's little bits of smoke that does come out. Mm-hmm. So, but vaping, ED medicine, that's a new frontier. Absolutely. And I hope you'll get to the bottom of it, Mr. Dowd.
What is next for GPZ, as you're referred to on your website?
Thanks for asking, because I'm less optimistic about having a next act, a final act, but some of my friends are optimistic for me. And I want to do two things when I depart ASU over the either next term or the following academic year. I want to resume writing full-time because I have many book ideas, and it may be that I've incubated in this sustained period of reflection and study at ASU, incubated some good books, as well as reflecting on my life as a whole and removing the financial pressures. Mm-hmm. Frankly, I had to support myself my whole life. I didn't have anybody who would support me. My parents were kind of hostile to the idea of being an independent writer. And also, I had a rare flair for marrying women who did not make much money. Because one of the things I tell young journalists today is if you want to succeed as a journalist today, you need a strategic marriage. You need to marry somebody making a lot of money, either in healthcare or finance or digital technology. Those are the keys. You've got to structure your romantic horizons around that, because for sure, you're not making much money. So, the financial concerns probably prevented me from writing more books. And then working at ASU, I was under the misguided impression that I had to give a lot of effort here, that I had to try hard and really help people. And that required a lot of concentration, especially because I've got a touch of madness, and if I'm not really trying to be nice and friendly to people, I've been known to be mean, intimidating, aggressive, and perhaps slightly dangerous. And we don't want that at ASU. Even I know that. And so I've spent a lot of energy trying to be on my best behavior. You can see how well it's gone. So I know it's been for a good cause, but all this has taken away from my writing because I've had 4 books that book lengths, and I have 1 collection of essays, and those 4 books took a level of concentration and focus that I don't think I can generate now while I'm doing research service, teaching, and also being in Arizona, which itself takes a lot of brain cycles, because I have this strategy when I'm here of trying to present myself in the guise of, say, retired law enforcement or special forces. Those are the 2 things I'm going for when strangers approach me. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean strangers on campus. I more mean in the civil society. There are a lot of retired law enforcement that like this hairstyle. Also, I'm engaged in a practice called strategic fatness. That's being fat on purpose. So this kind of bloating takes away your bone structure and makes everyone look the same. So I routinely have other white men come up to me and think they know me. They think I'm a cop or a soldier or a commander, because if you take most white guys, make them a little fat, shove their hair off, take it right off, and give them a little beard, they all look alike. So I literally look like some of these cops and soldiers that they knew, and in Arizona, frankly, that's a plus. I think if you got to look like anything in Arizona, you want to go for law enforcement. They're the most respected and feared. But, so writing books, and then second, and this is funny, is there's some belief that if I put the effort in, and I'm not sure I want to, that I could do a podcast or a kind of web TV show. And we do have a grant application with Templeton Foundation, very large foundation that looks at religion in American life. And if we get that grant, part of it will go towards launching a web TV, web podcast type program that I would either host or design, produce. Mm-hmm. It remains to be seen, but we will know in the next couple of months.
Okay. One last question.
Yes. By
far the most important question in the interview. As a New York City native, how do you feel about the Red Sox winning the World Series?
Oh, very funny. Well, they were a great team this year. Alex Cora, the rookie manager, did an excellent job. The Yankees were tortured this year because in some ways their big off-season acquisition, Stanton, was a bust. He's not a clutch player. I would recommend that he practice over the off-season. If he can't become a better hitter, we're in trouble. I was born in Brooklyn, and I was actually born on the day the Brooklyn Dodgers defeated the Yankees in a World Series. I'm born October 3rd, and the World Series occurred a little earlier back then. And I shouldn't like the Yankees. I should have liked the National League, because the National League was politically progressive. They were for integration. They were for the Yankees, and of course the Red Sox were the last team to have a black player, Pumpsy Green. And so, but I did become a big Yankee fan. I was a big fan of Mickey Mantle personally, another politically incorrect thing to do. I mean, Mickey Mantle was a womanizer, a drunk, and an idiot. But he happened to be great at playing baseball. And, number 7, I went to Mickey Mantle Day. One of the things, in 1965 when he retired, my father took me there. But, New York sports, they're all down. And all the teams are down, and it's tough. It's a tough time. But I don't love New York. I was exiled. I was not tough enough, belligerent enough, aggressive enough for New York. I was sent away. They do this thing when you graduate from college. They take all the men, and they test them to see how aggressive and violent they are, and I failed.
And they sent you to California.
They sent me to California because they thought, hey, look, you can pick on those people, push them around, get what you want. But New York, forget about it. You're out. And I never returned. I never lived there again. So, but the mark of being a New Yorker stayed with me, although not so much the accent, right? You can't hear that much of an accent, can you? No. Yeah, and I'm proud of that. But I was born in Brooklyn. My parents spirited me out of there as a child to Long Island. And Long Island, I ended up in the town of Massapequa, where the Gambino crime family lived across the street from us. And my father was very envious, because my father wanted to be part of the mafia, but he was too disorganized. He was an Italian-American. His name was supposed to be Zucchero. My name was supposed to be Pasquale Zucchero. And my parents were trying to become more American. They assimilated. They changed their name to something that sounded more English. And everything was downhill from there, basically. So, till I reclaimed some of this tradition by taking that name Pascal, which of course is a French name. My parents were a little confused about European languages. So, but I think this series you've got planned is good. I wish you well with it. There's a lot of interesting people on campus. There's 3,500 faculty, and out of that I'm sure you'll find 20 or 30 interesting people, okay? That won't be a problem.
I should hope so.
Yes.
Well, thank you for telling it like it is.
You're
And
welcome.
it's been a pleasure.
You too. Thanks.